Welcome to the Crosscreek On Demand podcast, a podcast for you because God is for you. On this episode, we continue our series Discovering God with part 4, What Does It Mean to Love Your Enemy? We'll discover how Jesus loved one of his worst enemies, Judas, and how we can change the world by doing the same thing.
I know right now, 1/3 of you, probably, if statistics are right, 1/3 of you are pretty thrilled about how the week went. I know 1/3 of you are angry, are worried, are fearful about how this week went. And I'm guessing another third, probably weren't going to be happy either way, right? And it's been a rough election season. It's been a rough, I don't know how many years, but for months and years, we've been told by politicians, by the media, by celebrities, probably by your great uncle on social media, that if we don't defeat them, whoever their them is, right? If we don't defeat them, whoever the enemies of our country, if we don't defeat them, then everything is going to fall apart. That's the message we've been hearing over and over. In fact, the voices around us have been desperately trying to convince us we have enemies all around us. The voices around us are trying to convince us that everywhere you look, next door, sitting next to you in church, there is an enemy that you've got to look out for. And what makes this whole thing even worse, even without all the politics, is this. We turn around, and then there are all of our in-our-face enemies that we see every single day that we have to deal with all day long. There are our coworkers, our bosses, our teachers, our neighbors, our exes. And hardest for me usually are, just being a little honest, people who it seems like have been disloyal in a way, disloyal to my friendship. That's the hardest for me. I always see those people as enemies, and I can't help it. And often, it's not just, these people aren't just people that we don't like and we just don't get along with. Many times, these are people who are actively out to get us, actively out to hurt us or someone we love. So they're actively trying to stab us in the back to get our job or just trying to make our life harder for some reason, whether it's with their actions or for some, maybe with their votes. And so what do we do with these enemies? I mean, we're all really good Americans in here. So what do we do with enemies when you're an American? We fight them. We crush them. We defeat them. That's what we do. That's what enemies are for, right? To be defeated. You fight an enemy. And if we don't stand up, guys, if we don't stand up, well, then we're weak and we'll lose. And it doesn't always mean we get physical, right? We're very kind people, but, maybe we'll complain about them. Maybe on social media, maybe behind their back, maybe to their boss. We post about them. We subtly try to undermine them in some way. We make jokes at their expense, which is something I have never done. And, sometimes, we have to argue, we have to belittle, and we have to defeat them. But if we look around, especially this week, we look around, none of those things really seem to work, do they? Whenever we try to defeat our enemies in any of those ways, it just makes them dig in deeper. It makes them fight against us even harder. And then we have to fight even harder. It's this never-ending cycle of trying to beat each other. And it doesn't work. But thankfully, Jesus gave us another option. Here's what he said. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you're kind only to your friends, how are you different than anyone else? Even pagans do that. So Jesus said, love your enemies. That is so stupid. What? Okay, you wouldn't say that, you're very good people. But, it's sweet and all, but that would never actually work in the real world, would it? How would you ever win that way? Loving your enemies? Doing good to them? How do they even know they're wrong if you're being all nice to them? And now, most of us wouldn't come out and say this, but maybe in our conversations, in our social media posts, in the way we talk about people, we show that this is what we think. That's a great idea, but it's kind of naive, Jesus. Why? Because Loving our enemies is the stupidest, most unproductive thing in the world. What's it going to accomplish? Nobody's going to lose, which means I'm not going to win. So it seems like the stupidest, most unproductive thing in the world. But Jesus actually showed us it's one of the most powerful things a human can do. Now, if you're sitting here, I want to let you off the hook. If you are sitting here, you're like, I'm not a Jesus follower, I just wanted to see Lori get dunked underwater, or, my wife or my friend made me be here. If you don't call yourself a Jesus follower, what I'm about to say, you are completely off the hook. You don't have to do any of it. You can just go, keep fighting, keep hating, keep doing whatever you want to do. I recommend you don't. But you can. You didn't agree to any of this. But if you are a Jesus follower, if you call yourself a Jesus follower and you're sitting here and you're listening to the podcast, what we're about to talk about, we don't have a choice. This is actually a direct command from our King to love our enemies. And so we have to figure it out. And what do we do with that? So now what? What does it actually mean to love our enemies? And not just stick our heads in the sand and hang out with the people who agree with us, right? That's not loving our enemies. That's just ignoring the rest of the world and getting in our echo chamber. So what I want to do tonight is see how Jesus loved his enemies. And doing that, we'll discover God's heart towards his enemies. Because Jesus didn't just tell us to love our enemies, he actually gave us an example to follow. See, Jesus changed the world by insisting on loving his enemies. Even when they tried to make it for him, he insisted on loving his enemies. And I think there's no better example than the way Jesus loved a man whose name has become synonymous with evil and betrayal and disloyalty. One of Jesus' 12 main followers, the one who betrayed Jesus to his death, Judas. That's when you hiss and boo. Ooh, Judas. Now, all four accounts of Jesus' life tell the story of Judas from different angles. It's like one of those really cool movies where the director takes different views and stuff. It's very interesting. But all of the stories of Jesus agree that Judas didn't accidentally get Jesus arrested. Like he let something slip and then Jesus got arrested. Or he didn't mean for it to happen. No, they all talk about how after spending maybe 3 years with Jesus, listening to him teach, watching him heal people, being on his inner circle where you hear the actual deep meaning of Jesus' teachings, Judas went out of his way to offer Jesus to his enemies, the religious leaders, and then actually led the soldiers to Jesus when he was arrested. I can't imagine a worse betrayal than that. It really, as I was working on this, it hit home with my disloyalty issues. And at Jesus' last meal, before he was arrested, he showed what it truly means to love your enemies. And that's what I want to look at tonight. So we're going to jump in. John 13. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, or dinner, if you're not from the South. It's time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, we don't know the exact reason Judas betrayed Jesus. Maybe it was for the money, because he got 30 pieces of silver, and I think John tells us that Judas was the one who took care of the money. He would steal some every once in a while. Maybe it was disillusionment, that Jesus wasn't actually fighting the Romans like maybe Judas thought the Jewish Messiah was supposed to do. But whatever the motive was, Satan had taken advantage of Judas's feelings, whatever those feelings were, taken advantage of those feelings, his weaknesses, and prompted him to betray Judas. And Jesus knew all of this. And Jesus loved Judas anyway. I think because he also knew Judas's story. Right? No matter how terrible Judas's reasons, no matter how terrible his actions were, Jesus understood how Judas got there. He knew he was being manipulated. He knew he was being controlled by sin, kind of what we talked about last time. He knew that Judas was a slave to sin, which gave Jesus empathy for Judas, gave him compassion, gave him understanding. See, empathy opens the door to love. Empathy opens the door to love. Being able to see from someone else's perspective. Being able to walk a mile in their shoes. Now, it doesn't mean what they are doing is right. Doesn't mean what Judas did was right. Doesn't mean we agree with people when we have empathy. It just means we try to see it from their point of view. Because when we see others through God's eyes, even our enemies, we start to love them like he does. And then the story goes on. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with a towel he had around him. And this, I mean, if you've been in church ever, you've probably heard about, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, right, at the Last Supper. It's such a profound section in the story of Jesus. And Jesus knew, I love that. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything. Jesus knew he was the King of Kings. Jesus knew he was the creator of the cosmos with all authority, with all power. So he made everybody bow down to him. So he made sure everyone believed the right thing so that he'd be worshipped properly. No, Jesus knew he was God on earth, so he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water in a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet. That's crazy. We can't let this slip by. Jesus knew Judas was actively in the process of betraying him. And he purposely washed Judas's hairy, calloused, stinky, dusty, donkey poop-covered feet on purpose. See, Jesus looked at one of his worst enemies. And he didn't just tolerate or ignore Judas, be like, oh, okay, Judas is over there, that's cool. He didn't pat himself on the back for, keeping his cool and not making a scene. He purposely chose to humbly serve Judas and do good for him. See, loving our enemies is a conscious choice to purposely do good for them. Loving our enemies is a choice, a conscious choice to do good for them. It's a selfless love. Right? It takes the self completely out of the equation. It has to. And it says, you, my enemy, are created in the image of God. That makes you important. That makes your needs as important as my needs. So what do you need right now? Not what do I think you need, but what do you actually, really, truly need right now? See, it's a love that gives without asking anything in return. So Jesus washes all of their feet, including Judas. And then he takes it even further. And we'll look at the story now from the perspective of Matthew, who also tells the same story. Matthew 26. When it was evening, Jesus sat down at the table. I'm assuming this is after washing the feet, with the 12. While they were eating, he said, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Greatly distressed, and our English I don't think has the right words. This is like a huge, oh my gosh, could it be me? Greatly distressed, each one asked in turn, am I the one, Lord? He replied, one of you who has just eaten from this bowl with me will betray me. For the Son of Man must die, as the Scriptures declared long ago. But how terrible it will be for the one who betrays him. It would be far better for that man if he had never been born. Judas, the one who would betray him, also asked, Rabbi, am I the one? And Jesus told him, you have said it. Notice how Jesus keeps it vague. He says, whoever, is eating out of this bowl with me. Well, guess what? It's a Middle Eastern meal where everyone's eating out of the same bowl. He's like, yeah, it's going to be one of you. It could have meant any of them. He doesn't call out Judas. He could have been like, Judas, it's you. You know it. But he lets Judas know that he knows. He doesn't bash him. He doesn't expose him. He doesn't throw him out. It almost seems like Jesus is giving Judas a chance to come clean, a chance to change his mind, maybe a chance to change his role in the story. Jesus knows he has to die. He knows that's part of the plan, but Judas doesn't have to be a part of it. It can happen another way. And so he gives him a chance, maybe step back, get a better perspective. He gives Judas a chance to return. See, love pursues reconciliation over winning. Jesus could have crushed Judas in that moment if he wanted to. He could have ordered his guys to throw him out and beat him up. But he wanted reconciliation over winning. Sadly, if you know the story, Judas doesn't take Jesus' offer. The other disciple said, is it I, Lord? Like this very respectful way to address Jesus. Is it I, Lord? But Judas uses the lesser title, rabbi. Is it I, teacher, instead of Lord? Now, if I were Jesus, and maybe if you were Jesus, but you're probably better than me, if I was Jesus, I would have said, seriously, Judas? Like, you know exactly what you are about to do. You know that I know what you're about to do right now. I gave you a chance, but now it's time for some smiting with my holy smiter. Like, it's time to whoop some butt. But Jesus is better than me. And so instead, he does the opposite. He invites Judas into an even deeper relationship. Matthew 26, verse 26. As they were eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat it, for this is my body." He took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant or the agreement between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many. Mark my words, I will not drink wine again until the day I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." That's the first communion, right? That's what we just read. Where Jesus gives the world a representation of a new agreement, a new contract between God and humanity, where humans don't have to try to earn God's approval by being really good and following all these different rules and rituals. That he's proven his love by coming to earth, dying and rising again to give us new life through him. Like this meal represents the fulfillment of God's promise to humanity, that he will put an end to sin, that he will put an end to death. And Judas was there for the entire thing. That's mind-blowing to me. Like, Jesus handed Judas the bread and the cup, saying, "This represents the death I'm about to die for all of you. I am dying so my enemies, including you, Judas, can be forgiven." See, Jesus died to love his enemies. Jesus died to love his enemies. And sadly, though Jesus gave him, I think, chance after chance, Judas still goes along with his plan. He leads the soldiers to Jesus. He betrays him with a kiss, and Jesus is arrested. And the next morning, it seems like Judas maybe comes to his senses and is overcome with regret. He repents. He throws money at the feet of the religious leaders, and then he goes out and sadly ends his own life. And a few hours later, Jesus also died. But on the third day after his death, the eyewitness accounts tell us Jesus rose again, defeating sin, defeating death, and proving he was actually God. And because of his great love for us, because of his love for his enemies, we, as we sang, we are now free. And those who follow him are empowered and commanded to love their enemies the same way he loved them. And now maybe you're thinking, that's a nice sentiment. That's a good story. You did okay telling it. It's a nice ideal to try to live up to. But come on, that doesn't work in the real world. Like, Jesus is one thing. He's God. Of course he could do that. Like, he's supposed to. It's in the book. But if we love our enemies like this, we'll look weak. People will take advantage of us. We will always lose, and evil will always win. They might think we agree with them and won't know that they're wrong. And if I love them and do good for them, how is that fair? Like, they won't get what they deserve. Those are good excuses. You guys are very smart and good at coming up with excuses. But do you know where all of those excuses come from? Fear. All of that comes from fear. See, we make excuses and don't even try loving our neighbors because we're afraid. We don't even try it. We try to come up with excuses, say, oh, that won't work. Why? Because we are afraid. We're afraid of losing. We're afraid of not getting what we deserve. We are afraid that justice won't be done. Jesus didn't have those fears. Do you know why? We kind of brushed through it pretty quickly. Let's go back to John 13:3. Why didn't Jesus have those fears? Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. Jesus didn't have those fears because he knew who he was. He didn't need to fear his enemy. He didn't need to fear his betrayer. He knew he was in control and had all control. And he knew that true, perfect justice would be done in God's perfect way and perfect timing. And if you are a Jesus follower, we don't have to fear loving our neighbor if we actually trust that Jesus is who he said he is, and he can do what he said he can do. We can trust his perfect justice and his perfect timing and his sovereignty as king of the universe. And I think this is the key for every Jesus follower. When we are free of fear, we are free to love our enemies. When we are free to fear, we are free to love. So, my question is, right now, after this fun week, who's your Judas? Who's your enemy? Who's your Judases, Judai, whatever is the plural of Judas? Judases. Maybe your Judases are actively seeking your harm, like the first Judas did. Maybe they have hurt you. Maybe they've hurt someone you love. Maybe it's a neighbor or an ex or an in-law or a coworker or a boss. Maybe it's a betrayal by a friend. Maybe it's a faceless Trump supporter. Maybe it's a faceless Kamala supporter. Here's what Martin Luther King Jr. said. He said, love is the only creative, redemptive, transforming power in the universe. Love is the only creative, redemptive, transforming power in the universe. So do you want your enemies to go away? Love them and transform them into friends. I know it's easier said than done. And so we need to practice it. So here's my invitation to practice it this week, and maybe for the rest of your life. Read Romans 12. It's not short, but let's read it. I'll read it to you. This is actually Paul talking, what it means to follow Jesus. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't, everyone, think you know it all. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. That is what it means to love your neighbor. That's what it means to love your enemy. So read that this week, maybe for a little inspiration. And pray this, if you have the guts. Jesus, let me see my enemy or my enemies through your eyes. Let me see them through your eyes as your beloved children that you died for. And then if you really want the gold star, find one way to purposely love an enemy this week. One way, just one. Whether they accept that love or not. See, you are only responsible for your part. Some people will try to make it hard for you to love them. And so you just tell yourself, I'm going to love you even more now. You don't like it? Fine. What else can I do? And maybe right now, I don't know, what the relationships are. Maybe the best way to love them is to pray for them. To pray that God will bless them. Not that God will change them. That's different. That God will actually do good to them, that they will see that God loves them because of the good he's done for them. And while you're doing that, all of us, don't forget to ask ourselves who we have been a Judas to. Ask forgiveness. Accept God's forgiveness that we talked about last week, and start actively loving. So, even if the politicians are right, and half of our neighbors are our actual enemies, purposely seeking to destroy everything we hold dear, even if that's true, do you know what that means for a Jesus follower? That means we have a lot of amazing opportunities to practice loving our neighbors. You just have to turn one way or the other. It's amazing. We call that a target-rich environment. But in a divided world, guys, we have an unprecedented opportunity. Like, what if instead of adding to the anger and adding to the hate and adding to the darkness and adding to the fear, we, the followers of the true King, were a bright beacon of love and forgiveness? What if we were the ones who shined out courageous hope and faith and peace? What if we are the ones who finally show people there is another way than all the anger and the hatred and the fear? If you are a Jesus follower, our King has called us to love our enemies just as he loved us. We don't have to fear looking weak. We don't have to fear being taken advantage of, and we don't have to fear losing. We can trust the one who has overcome all things. Love is not weak. Love is powerful. And so let's take one step, just one step this week, to love our enemies and let God handle the rest. Our job is just to love. He will handle the rest. See, when we love our enemies, we become part of God's mission of reconciliation.